Society reinforces a confusing combination of messages about the characteristic and skills that men must have. And demonstrating the traditional expectations is rewarding, again, in some settings, like the work setting, achievement in school, but it has maladaptive consequences in interpersonal and intrapersonal ways. If a work setting requires a collaborative approach, for example, men may have problems, and I've worked with men in that regard. Men who cannot meet gender role standards, whether due to aging, to discrimination, for example, men of color or gay men, may suffer or struggle about feelings of worth. For example, men of color have less longevity than white men, at least partly because of the chronic stress from pressure. Men of color are socialized to believe that they also must be, as men, productive, successful, achievement-oriented, and so on, but are often less able to do so due to discrimination and oppression. When I look at the health disparities, when I look at my own family, my mother had 8 siblings, my father had 8 siblings. They all were married or partnered. And when I look at the survivors of that family, including aunts who were just 3 or 4 years older than I am, because I was the oldest and they were the youngest. All the men have died. All the men have died in my family. All the Latino men have died. All the women up to a couple of weeks ago were alive, except for an 80-some-odd-year-old aunt who just died. So that says something, I think, in terms of the we know a lot more about the mind-body connection and how physical problems, 60 to 90%, depending on which research you look at, of all physical ailments are stress-related or stress-induced. So there are all kinds of things that we need to realize about men's development. For example, how many of you are in the Division 51 listserv? Anybody here on it? Okay. If you were paying attention last week, you saw a story about the ABC report on May 28th that reported a story on sack tapping, where boys hit each other on the genitals to see who can take the pain and who cannot. And there have been reports of serious damage to testicles in hospitals and doctors as a result of the game. It's conceptualized as a way to provide invincibility, dominance, and to prove one's masculinity, defined in these ways. And people talked about pain games, which seem to be prevalent in locker rooms, men's dorms, and boys' gatherings to demonstrate who is and who is not vulnerable or weak. Any of you familiar with any of these games or heard of some of them, maybe even experienced some of them? You want to share what you know, some that you may know?
Thinking about as a kid playing games of Rochambeau, you kind of slap each other's arms to see who could do it the hardest.
Slap each other's arms, see who can do it the hardest? Yeah, like what is that? I mean, what is, like you look at it and you say, what? and it's this sort of insidious message that they have to prove invincibility and strength. Yes?
On the show Deadliest Catch, it's a show about Alaskan crab fishermen, and a father and his son actually engaged in that game together, where they put their arms next to each other and dropped a lit cigarette between their arms, and whoever pulled their arm away first was less masculine.
And this was on television.
Well,
So,
the actual act was not on television, but them talking about it fondly was.
talking about it fondly to see who, father and son, could withstand the pain from cigarette burning on their arms. Okay. So we see the kind of pressure that many men have to deal with. I saw a young Latino man who described his pain and lack of desire to identify with his community because of teasing and physical sort of challenges and alienation from other Latino young men during high school for not engaging in such behaviors. And the stories of men who don't fit in because they don't want to participate. I think some young men with a great deal of confidence and support are able to bypass those pressures easily, but I suspect that most young men and boys are challenged by it, have difficulty with it when they're made fun of or excluded. Any other comments about these kinds of socialization processes? Okay. Let me briefly talk about several basic ethical principles that are involved in the psychotherapeutic process. Ken Pope and I talk about these on our book on ethical psychotherapy. First, we have to acknowledge the reality and importance of the individuals whose lives we affect by our professional status. This means instilling in and reminding ourselves of a care perspective. We have to care for the humanity of those whose lives we influence. This is a cornerstone to our work. We often forget about this. We get so mundane and routine, we forget that people coming into our offices often it takes courage, it takes vulnerability, and it's a big deal for them. Ethical therapy involves the recognition of trust that clients place in us, power we have over clients, and caring. Second, we must understand the nature of the professional relationship and professional interventions. We have to make sure that we're competent in our work and take responsibility for the knowledge about how our behaviors help or potentially hurt our clients. This is my life's work. I do full-time independent practice, and I do psychotherapy day in and day out. And I really enjoy it. It's almost like an altered state. How many of you practice psychotherapy? Okay, just about everybody here. And you almost have to go into an altered state to be able to tune into the person and it's an awesome profession, to make determinations moment to moment about what kind of intervention to make. Are you going to engage in psychoeducation? Are you going to move into an experiential, emotional experience? Are you going to process in the here and now? Are you going to explore history? There's so many different decisions to make as we go about it. We have to understand what we're doing. It's both a science and an art. And, it's an amazing process. And we have to affirm accountability for our behavior. We have to take responsibility for the climate and structures that we set as an important basic task for professional ethics. I was in session last week with a very bright woman, and I sort of repeated something that's sort of a theme in terms of what she's doing. And she looked at me and she said, I feel real talking down to right now. And I said, you know what? I think you're right. I think I wasn't listening closely enough to what you're saying right now. And so we processed that and went on. And at the end of the session, I looked at her and I said, I really like how direct you are. And she just smiled. She was glad that was an okay thing to do. She said, sometimes people say I'm too forward. And I said, well, in here, it works. In here, it works. And if it's too forward sometime, I'll let you know. So we have to take responsibility for what we do. And, one of the things that happens is that most of the time, clients don't tell us. Most of the time, clients don't tell us when they're uncomfortable with what we did or said or what happens. The reality is that the majority of us don't always say, in our human interactions, we don't always say what we think. How many of you, for example, aren't always fully honest with your physicians or dentists or maybe your therapists? How many of you have not always been? Yeah, almost all of us have something that we don't, I'm in physical therapy right now. I don't always tell them how, they forgot to do what they said they were going to do last time. There are all kinds of things that come up that we're not always happy with our providers, and we need to set an atmosphere where we encourage people to do that. So in terms of learning to practice ethically, we have to commit to an ongoing experience because there are dilemmas that come up day in and day out. With all our clients and patients, we're often presented with situations, issues, content that present a dilemma in regard to how to proceed in therapy, for example. We can have all kinds of dilemmas, but I'm going to focus today on those involved in counseling men that present dilemmas in the psychotherapeutic process. The definition of a dilemma is that it's a situation for which no course of action seems satisfactory. The dilemma exists because there are good but contradictory ethical reasons to take conflicting and incompatible courses of action. This is a definition by Karen Kitchener.